Thank you very much. Okay, hi. We've met, haven't we? I'm Doug. In case you didn't know, I'm Doug Brown. Feel free to get in touch if you've got any questions about this. So you've done the web app material, you've done a lot of coding and so on, and what I gather you haven't covered is things like how to think critically about the output, think about how users are going to read your work and understand it, because basically the product of your work is going to be a text that can be read in different ways. So it might not use words, it might purely be nothing but symbols, but it's still going to be a text that can be read, and texts are ambiguous and can be understood in different ways. They have built-in uncertainties, all these sorts of things. So we're going to talk about the theory of this sort of thing. So the fundamental principles of geovisualization, which encompass quite a lot of the principles of good design as well. So you've probably read something about principles of good design, you might have done some work on principles of good design. This is the sort of thing that we're going to talk about, but also how to work it specifically into your geovisualization work. So when we talk about geovisualization, we've probably covered this with David already, but what is geovisualization? And it's a very broad term, and I'm not going to go into too much detail about all the different potential meanings of geovisualization, but I think we can sort of boil it down to visualizing spatial data. Does that sound right to you, though? Does that kind of cover everything? You can probably think of things that you've done for geovisualization that don't include these, but broadly, visualizing spatial data is kind of covering everything. So we say that maps are spatial data graphics. When you boil it down, you create a map. It's basically a graphic that communicates some kind of spatial data. For me, a map is any kind of graphic that represents a relationship. I think that's the key thing. I think that when you're displaying connections, displaying relationships, that's when it becomes a map. And it doesn't, I think, have to have real-world location sorts of things. I don't just mean fictional maps. I mean, you've heard of mental maps, cognitive maps, right? You've heard that sort of expression. So the idea of being able to map relationships, write down your thoughts and draw lines between them, and that's not called a map by accident. It's because it embodies a relationship, and that's the thing that you want to communicate. So when you want to communicate your data, or whatever it is that you're trying to get across, what's important for me is the relationship. Otherwise, it's just a lot of dots. So even if it's just dots with a base map, you've got a relationship between the dots and the base map. So if you don't have this point data in reference to something else, then you're missing out. But of course, it can be much more complex than just dots on a base map. So we can say maps are spatial data graphics, but what else might be considered a spatial data graphic that's not a map? What kind of things represent spatial data, or represent spatial data relationships, but aren't necessarily maps? Points? Graphs, yeah. Why not graphs? So just because it's spatial data doesn't mean it has to be on a map, okay? It might be that a map is the most efficient and effective way of communicating, but it might be that a graph, a chart, is much simpler. So you don't need to think automatically spatial data must be map. You can just have a few words. You've got the country divided. You ever see those maps where you've got the country divided into regions? It's got 5 regions, and they're all coloured in like a choropleth. And you think, well, what's the point? They're all different colours, and you don't know what it doesn't represent anything. But if you just have the name and a percentage, or name and a value of whatever it is, percentage unemployed, or whatever it might be, I think that can be much more effective. Simple table, even. So it doesn't have to be a map to represent spatial data. You could have an entire GIS with no visual front end, it would still be a GIS. Right? It's just a database that includes spatial data. So you can think quite broadly about this, and that means that you could have maps tied in with other sorts of visualizations. You could have maps with graphs. You know what a map with a graph built into it looks like. You can think of reasons for having that. You know, you use the sort of the classification systems in ArcMap. You know, the default, the Jenks natural breaks algorithm and so on. The natural breaks algorithm can be a really useful one, but we tend to warn people, don't use it, because it's not obvious what the breaks are. But actually, it's quite a clever way of dividing up the data. So what do? If you've got the natural breaks, if you've got data divided into these natural breaks, according to Jenks' method, have a histogram that shows where the breaks are. And that gets around this whole problem of why on earth are these points all collected into these groups, or these features collected into these groups. So maps plus different sorts of spatial data work quite well together. So think broadly is my big point there. And when you're thinking about how to put together your visualization, you want to think about these groups of things, these broad topics. Audience, purpose, the nature of the data, the medium that you're going to be using, and the available tools. So I thought we could look at some of these in turn. So basically you want to think about who's going to be using your map. So where would you say the meaning of a map is? So a silly question. So does a map have a meaning? You generate a map, and it's going to be read by somebody. Where's the meaning? Go on. Mm-hmm. So where's the meaning of it? Where does the meaning happen? So what the user sees. Okay. I would agree that it happens in the user's brain. I think that it's very easy to think that you are putting meaning into your map. You can do that. You have to work hard to create the conditions for the user to take meaning from it. But it's a conversation, in essence. You're communicating with a user. They are going to get some meaning from your map, from your geovisualization, from whatever it is, but it's going to happen inside their brain, not in yours. So you have to do your utmost to make sure that there is, if you don't want to generate ambiguity, and there are lots of reasons why you might want to, but if you don't want to generate ambiguity, you want to remove all the possible layers of meaning that exist in the user's brain that aren't in yours, and that's a really difficult job, because the user will always bring their own context to reading a map. They'll always understand a map or anything else by thinking about what they already know. So, for instance, you think about a map, a road map, and you think, what's the symbol for a motorway? How is a motorway normally symbolised on a map that we might see in Britain? What's the standard motorway? It's blue, it's thick, it might have a white line down the middle, but you know roughly what it's going to be, okay? But you know that because you've seen it before. That's what you expect, okay? So if you are doing a road map, you want to make a road map, and you want to show a motorway, you don't want to have a dotted line that's normally associated with a footpath, okay? You want to choose the thing that people are normally going to associate, because otherwise they have to think. You don't want them to think too hard. You want it to be as easy as possible for them to get the meaning in a glance, without having to refer to the legend if you can help it. And ultimately they will probably have to refer to the legend, but you want to keep it as simple as possible and take advantage of what they already know. But you don't know what they already know. So it's a balancing act. It's difficult, but bear in mind that lots of things will have meanings that aren't the meaning that you expect them to have. So there might be, in the States, for instance, the United States, that's not the highway, the interstate line is not a thick blue line in the same way that the motorway line is. So think about your audience. So you can also think about who your audience is by thinking about who they are in these broad terms. Is your piece of work supposed to be seen by members of the public? And what can you say about what they know? You have to think about lowest common denominators here. What are the most number of people likely to know and understand? with the minimum effort, if it's for the public. If it's commercial, if it's government, if it's academic, then you can think about what they are expecting to see. And that would have to be industry specific or government specific or field specific, if you see what I mean. If it's academic, well, obviously academics are much more able to grasp complexities without too much effort. But specialists will have a much, academics and specialists will think differently about it in some respects, but also you can't expect that people are going to overthink it. So in all cases, you have to think about lowest common denominators. You can't expect that academics and specialists really are going to have some kind of superior knowledge about what you mean. They're not going to be thinking any harder about it. They're going to be looking at a quick glance and see what they understand. And that's always going to be the case. But specialists will know what a set of symbols is likely to be. You know, if you're a specialist petroleum industry type, you're going to have a set of symbols that you expect to see on a petroleum map. So you can just use the set of symbols that they're already using. You don't have to reinvent all of that. That won't necessarily work for the public. You might have to have a more explanatory, expository legend to go with it. But you think about the first step in when you're making your map is who's it for? Who's going to see this? And then you can start thinking about what you can actually expect them to know. And in many cases, it will be very little. In almost all cases, you can't go wrong if you expect them to know almost nothing, because that way you catch as many people as possible. Does that make sense? Okay. So the next thing to think about is what's the point? Why are you making this map? And different sorts of maps will have, or different sorts of visualizations will, thinking about these sorts of things, it's quite basic, you know, it's quite straightforward, but you have to think about these things in terms of methodology, you know, think about it in a kind of methodical way. So when you're making it, don't just think, yeah, I know this stuff, audience, whatever. You think to yourself, right, I'm going to think about my audience, and then I'm going to think about my, the purpose of the map and so on. So you think carefully about how it's all going to be put together by thinking about the purpose. What am I doing? I've got my data set. Are people likely to be using it for all of these things, analysis, decision making, etc.? I don't need to read out the whole lot, but you can probably think of many other things that a map might be used for, or a geovisualization might be used for. And then you can combine these two. So once you've got your audience and your purpose thought about, have you seen this sort of pyramid of understanding before? Familiar with this? Basically, you get some keywords stuck on top of this pyramid, and they are sort of translated into other keywords on the right-hand side. But at the bottom, knowledge, basic knowledge. Once you get a kind of fundamental understanding of what something is, the comprehension comes after the basic facts. So you assimilate the basic facts, and that will lead somehow to comprehension. You know, the dividing lines between these sections are more fluid than they appear. And I'm kind of suspicious of these easy graphics that kind of attempt to shoehorn cognitive behavior and cognition in general into vector graphics. But let's go with it anyway. So once you've got comprehension, then you can think about applying that. Okay? So once you've got the ability to use it in other situations, the ability to apply your knowledge, to apply this knowledge, then you can think about analysis and so on, synthesis, so combining knowledge and evaluation. And that's the sort of critical pinnacle. So when we are marking your work, for instance, we're looking for critical evaluations rather than simply the display of knowledge. So that kind of applies to the work that you hand in and we mark and so on. But what you can think about, who is likely to apply which bits of this to the geovisualization that you're creating? So other than someone who's marking your work, but if you're thinking in terms of the member of the public or whatever it is, who is your real or theoretical ultimate audience for your piece of work? Then you can think about, is this the sort of person who is going to be using this to apply their knowledge to some other situation, or is this the sort of person who's going to be evaluating different scenarios and using synthesis of information, these sorts of things? Does that make sense? The next thing to think about is, what have you got to deal with? What is the nature of your data? It's very easy to say, well, spatial information, obviously, but there are lots of different sorts of spatial information, and that's going to guide your workflow, but it's also going to guide your ultimate output. So if you've got a load of postcodes, for instance, then you want to be thinking in terms of polygons rather than points, depending on the scale. So you want to be thinking about scale all the time anyway. But spatial information could be anything, and it could be any kind of scale and any kind of type of data. So you can think about that. And that will guide what you're doing. It could be quantitative or it could be qualitative. There's some quite good work in GIS in qualitative data. I would recommend having a look at some of that. Things like Ian Gregory at Lancaster. Have you come across him? Has done some stuff on the Lake District and how... Are you familiar with the Romantic poets? Yeah, so people like Wordsworth going around the Lake District, writing lots of work. You can follow his writing lots of poems about nature. You can trace where he went. Sorry? Yeah. Yeah, so you can trace where he went and then work out things like what words appear most often in what places, and that can give you an idea about, if you get the word spectacular appearing a lot for a particular kind of view over a gorge or something like that. And so this is an amazing piece of work, and it's all leading to something else, which is, it's a kind of, ultimately he wants to work out something about mortality by using qualitative sources. So he wants to be able to have a text miner that pulls out words like, sickness has got lots of different synonyms. So if you want to come up with some kind of way of pulling out from medical reports all the kind of location data plus these sort of qualitative bits of data. So you'll be able to work out where the hotbeds of sickness were at particular times, this sort of stuff. Anyway, do you have manageable data or is it big data? Do you know what I mean by big data? Mm-hmm. What makes data big rather than just a lot? Storage capacity is one. That might be one. Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's the converse of it, I suppose. Yeah. So essentially, big data is something that stretches current algorithms and memory. So you might have storage capacity, but do you have working memory to deal with it? So big data is basically anything that requires us to think about how we're going to chop it up into little chunks and deal with it. So if you've got big data, you'll want to think carefully about how you go about running your project. But it's quite easy to get hold of big-ish data. So you might want to use it. Live feed or static, obviously you have to think differently about whether you're getting material from different places, whether you've got reliable sources, whether you've got just one data set that's not going to change, these sorts of things. Are things going to be automatically updated, or do you have to do some database management to go and fetch the new data? Is it really live, or is it kind of semi-live? So all these sorts of things are going to have an impact on what you're doing. And what are the units? I mean, it's really easy, but really easy to get this wrong. But it's also linked with scale. But essentially, there are all sorts of examples of people who think they're working in millimeters and turn out to be working in inches, and it all goes horribly wrong. So if it's not your data set, know it before you start playing with it, I guess. Any questions about any of this? Does that make sense? Cool. So the medium, the next thing to think about. What is your publishing medium? Is it going to be on paper? Is it going to be online? Is it going to be shown on television? Is it going to be three-dimensional, interactive, static? All these things you want to think about quite carefully. No doubt you've already come across different ways of presenting material like this. If your work is going to be on TV, you want to make it super, super simple. it's 3D, you want to make it even more simple, because the more variables you have, the more difficult it is to deal with that. So you want to have a kind of minimum without having too little to get your point across. And that is a balancing act as well, and not something that's easily taught. You just have to practice and get people to evaluate the work. And lastly, I forget, what are the available tools? What have you got? What can you actually work with? It's all very well thinking, I've got this fantastic idea for a project. Dave's going to love my GeoWeb application. I'm going to do something that's going actually to take me 3 years and £15,000 of research funding to do. Wonderful, apply for a PhD. That would be brilliant, but might not be suitable for your end of term assessment. So there are things to worry about. What are the available resources? And if all you've got is a paper and pencil, then, well, obviously that's not going to apply to this class, but what can you do with what you've got? Do you know all the things that you want to do, or are you going to have to learn something new? Are you going to have to go away and learn Python, or are you going to have to learn some complicated statistics, analytical tools? Can you use CAD properly? Can you use GIS properly? What's your level of knowledge? And self-assessment is your friend here. Be honest with yourself about what you can do, what you need to know to get to the next stage. And don't rely on someone else telling you necessarily. You have to think quite carefully about what you can do and what you've got available to you. But it might turn out that there's quite a lot more available to you that you can learn quite quickly than you think. So make sure you play around with what's it called, the service store? Yeah, so have you had a good look at all the things that are available on the service store? So I highly recommend just scrolling through and saying, oh, that looks quite interesting. I might just activate this and see if it does something cool, because it might. But do you have the time? Do you need other people to help you? What do you know? So this is all straightforward, right? But I highly recommend seeing what software is available while you're here, because when you're not here, you will suddenly realise that's an amazing resource, and now I don't have access to CAD, or, well, you can get free CAD now, but, whatever it might be. Okay, have you come across the word semiotics before? Okay, semiotics basically means symbols, understanding how do we think about symbols. It's basically theorizing about symbols. The semiotics is the study of how symbols convey meaning, as I've put on the slide. So here we have Ferdinand de Saussure saying that a sign is a relationship. It consists in the relationship between the signifier and the signified. And nothing is a sign unless it is interpreted as a sign. So just because you think that you've put a label in the right place doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be understood as being the piece of information that you think it is. Do you see what I mean? But it's also worth pointing out that it's not simply the existence of a word. Okay, so here we've got two signs, but we've got some contextual information as well. Okay, so same word, obviously, but what does the one on the left mean? Shop is open. What does the one on the right mean? Open the train door. Okay, what happens if you press that button? Interesting, okay, it looks like a toilet one. It's actually from the outside of the tube train, okay? What happens if you press the button? Doesn't open the door, though. No. And you can spot a tourist because they're pressing the open button on the outside of the tube. So here is a missed sign, a mal-created sign, okay? Designed accidentally to make you think that if you press it, something happens. There's no haptic response. You press it, it doesn't go like on the overground trains or like National Rail. You press those, the doors actually open. You can feel it going click when you press it. With that, it looks like the sort of thing that should. Now, it's possible that the company that makes these, Alstom or whoever it is, actually supplies exactly the same train carriage to all over Europe and in other parts of the world. When you press the button, something happens. Nonetheless, people are very used to pressing this button and not getting any response, so you know not to. But almost everybody will have pressed it once, not thinking. That's how you find out that it doesn't do anything. So you've got the same word with very different meanings. We are open for business. Here it is a piece of information to you. about the state of the entity. Okay, here it's a piece of information about what's about to happen. The light comes on and it opens, but it's also supposed to be a kind of press the, it's an instruction to you. Press the button to do this thing. So same word, different context, different symbols, misdirection, but nonetheless you get the point, right? Same word, different symbols. So that kind of proves that what is happening is that the meaning is in the relationship. The meaning is not in the sign. The meaning is in the relationship. Well, the sign is the relationship between the signified and the signified. The meaning is happening in your brain. It's not an intrinsic part of the word open, because the word open can have different meanings depending on context and us. Make sense? So be wary of misdirection, but also be wary of multiple meanings for things that you think are going to be straightforward. Worry about your semiotics. So graphics. Graphics are usually considered to be much more simple to understand than words. That isn't always the case. Here we have something on the left. It's about 20,000 years old. What's happening on the left? On this side. What's happening on the left? They're hunting deer, okay? It's 20,000 years old. I guarantee you wouldn't understand if the person who made this described what was happening to you using words. But we get this, right? And how many people in this room have actually hunted deer using bows and arrows? Okay. How many people have fired a bow and arrow? I did when I was on a youth camp when I was 10. I know people who did it for university as undergraduates, but archery is not a particularly common exercise at the moment. And deer, I mean, we know what deer look like. We've seen them in the park, maybe, but they're not kind of everyday animals, right? We get this. We totally know what this means, and it's speaking to us from 20,000-year-old caves, and absolutely beautiful as well with it. I think this is just the most. I just love the elongated, the sense of movement, everything. Okay, does anybody know what this is on the right? It's a mathematical equation. Do you know? Yeah. It's something to do with calculus. Any more than that? I can't tell you. I couldn't tell you. I'd need some more context. Yeah. I can't go any further than that either. Okay, so we know vaguely what it means, but these aren't, they're originally letters, right? But we're not treating them as letters, the delta and all this stuff. We're not treating them as letters, we're treating them as signs that aren't actually letters, because they're not elements of, you don't say d when you come across a delta, so we're not using them to express a phoneme, but here are graphics which it's easier than explaining it in words, maybe, only if you're familiar with the concept already. If I wanted somebody to explain that to me, I'd like them to explain it by telling me what the meanings of the symbols are, not by just saying it in, just speaking the mathematical notation. Okay, so graphics and symbols are not always simpler. Sometimes, but not always. So think about whether you've got yourself a beautiful, impossible to misunderstand kind of primal understanding graphic, or you've got something that's not quite on the level of most of the people in your audience. So remember, when we talk about audience, that is firmly in the specialist audience camp. And I don't want to see labels that look like that, because I wouldn't understand them. Okay, what's this? Start button. Okay, what's the one at the top? Okay, and what's that one? Blank page. New, what's that one? What's that one? Upload. Okay, that one. Hands up. I can't ask you how old you are. Well, hands up if you ever actually used a floppy disk that looked like that. Yeah, okay, cool. Hands up if you've used one in the last 5 years, last 10 years. 10 years maybe at a pinch. Okay. Okay, so that's out of date, and there were plenty of people who have no idea what that actually is. They know it means save, but they don't know why. Okay, what's that one then? What's that? That one? Contacts or email. Second last. Server. And close. Okay. Let's see if you're right. New? Yes. Open? Yes. Convert? Nobody said convert. Save? Save as? Yes. Print? Yes. Prepare? What does prepare mean? What happens if you click on prepare? I think that's where you go. Send. Send it. Okay. Publish. Anybody used that one before? Close. Okay. So here we have a set of symbols, which are 50% of them, ish. How many did we get? We got that 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. We've got 10 symbols, and we knew 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 60% of the symbols, I think, that we knew, okay? But hopefully I've illustrated the point. These symbols are virtually meaningless, and so, 40% of them are meaningless as purely as symbols. The symbol doesn't tell you the meaning, okay? So why they don't just have the text, what's the point of the symbol? When you think, oh, I want to save this as a PDF, my thought process when I want to save something as a PDF is not to go to, oh, prepare, that's the right place to go, isn't it? I'll look for the tick-tick pencil sign. I usually go to, I want to save it as a PDF, let's go to save as. Oops, no, that's not right. Is it one of, yeah, it must be prepare also, it must be prepare. Click on prepare, and then it's, whatever. That's my thought process. Just the existence of this is confusing for me. So try not to replicate this abomination of startup ribbon, or whatever it's called. If you're going to have symbols, make them mean something, make them legible without the text. Otherwise, all you need is the text. And if you want to have both to train people to remember the symbols, the best thing to do is not to have the text at all. Okay. You use ArcMap, don't you? You use ArcGIS. And you're familiar by now with the symbols, which are totally impenetrable at the beginning. Okay. But you learn them by not seeing the words. What's the difference between Arc Catalog and Arc Toolbox when you're using it in the very first week? You can't. It's too small to see properly even. It's only by hovering over and by clicking it that you find out what it actually is. You hover over and you get a little message that says Arc Toolbox. So it's only under those circumstances that you actually get to learn what the symbol means. So don't bother having a symbol and the word at the same time. It's either the symbol or the word. In this case, I think the words would have been preferable, but I guess they had to have symbols because they already had symbols for some of the things. When they wanted to add a prepare and a send and so on, they couldn't do away with the save button altogether, because then people would say, what about my floppy disk? I don't know where to look. I can't read the word save in a fraction of a second. All I can do is see the 3.5-inch disk symbol.
Maybe they put USB sign.
Yeah, but every now and again they think about replacing these symbols. And people say, no, we're used to this one. And anyway, USB is going to be obsolete pretty soon anyway. What are they going to replace it with? A cloud? Well, they could do. Why not? I don't trust the cloud. I don't like the cloud. So hopefully I'll never have, I don't want to save to the cloud. I'm quite happy to do this. But why is it this symbol? Why isn't it the 5.25-inch disk? Anybody remember the 5.25-inch disks? They were actually floppy. This isn't a floppy disk. The disk inside that is floppy, but that doesn't flop about. The 5¼ inch disk, that was a floppy disk. Okay, so we've got words. We've introduced the concept of words. So visualizations usually have some text somewhere. It might be labels, it might be instructions, it might be information given in the legend stroke key. It might be logos that contain words, company names, whatever it might be. So when do you use text and when do you use graphics? Well, now there's a question. Images versus words. The battle continues. When might you use images? When might you use words? Well, when you're thinking about images, images are very good for representing spatial structures. They're good for, what do I mean by that? Can you give an example? When is an image a symbol given as a graphic rather than as a word? Because words are symbols. Can you give me an example of an image being used as a spatial structure? Let's say you're looking at a map. Okay. Mountains? Buildings? Features on a map, right? Roads, natural features, in fact, anything. Images are better than words. Although you do get those maps where you see the name of the street actually being the street. Yeah, so you have the word, Oxford Street, winding along in a straight line, But that's being clever. That's just gimmicky. But in general, the image the graphic is perfectly adequate. Okay. Images are good for locations, point data in particular, or boundaries. They're good for showing detail. You can cram more information into a picture. A picture paints 1,000 words, as you've no doubt heard. You can cram a lot of information into a symbol that you can grasp quite quickly, and good for structural relationships. And after all, relationships are at the heart of a map. So, that's what a map is. So, indicating relationships through images. Words, as you no doubt can read for yourself, words are good for procedural information, instructions. If you want to, if you're using a map for wayfinding, that's great. You can see how to get from A to B using a map, right? But you can also get from A to B using procedural information expressed in words. Turn left out of the front door, keep going until you get to the post box on the corner, turn right until you get to the corner shop. Okay. Procedural information. And that can be much more useful than a map. If you can retain those 3 sentences, I can't, I made them up off the top of my head and I can't remember what I said, but if you're asking, when you ask for directions and you can't quite take it in, let's assume that you could take it in or you jotted it down. You'd have procedural information that will be even easier than the map in some cases. It depends. Yeah?
That's why, for example, the TomTom or your Google Map now, you can see the map in front of you, but when you're driving, you hear the actual information from the map. It helps a lot.
Exactly.
Some people can't even do the map. They need to hear what the individual is actually saying, the instructor or the guide.
Yeah, take the next left. Then because you can't work out your speed.
Exactly.
It says turn left in 300 feet. You think, how big is a foot? And how 300 feet? What is 300 feet? Good for logical conditions. If it's like this, then do that. If the corner shop is closed, then keep going until you get to Tesco's. Abstract concepts, very difficult to communicate abstract concepts using, how do you illustrate peace? I don't know whether you would want to have a map of peace. You could have a map of peace, I'm sure there's a way. Easier done in words than in images, and conditions for action, so that's sort of logical conditions, same sort of thing, just repetitive. And of course, exceptions to all of these. So it doesn't go without saying, but there are times when you will want to use one or the other. So here you've got the option. So think about whether you've got an image and a word. Do you need both? Which one are you going to choose? Just don't forget you want the minimum amount that's necessary. You're always going to go for images. Is that that's your instinct? Mhm. In many cases, but I would draw your attention to the bit at the bottom. So yes. Mhm. Quite. Okay, so graphic variables. There's a lot to say about all of this, so I'm going to skim through. But essentially, you want to make sure that when you are thinking about your different variables, you want your classes to, the symbols to match the data. Okay. It might be a color scheme. You know when you've got a range of values from -1 to +1? You know when you're, I don't know, let's say you're mapping a standard deviation or something like that, and you know that you want, presumably you want to go from a color scheme that uses dark blue to dark red via something soft in the middle like yellow, pastel colours in the middle or something to be roughly 0, yeah? You're not going to go from very light blue to very dark blue when the values go from -1 to +1. Yeah? You know that, right? Have you covered that before? Okay, so that's the sort of thing that I'm talking about. But also you can think about what does the phenomenon look like in real life? Is there a symbol that works with that? I don't mean you want to have a little petrol symbol to indicate where the petrol station is, although that's a good thing too. But in terms of classifying the data, you want to have different sized blobs or different color blobs, but not a combination of both, because you want to use one different method of differentiation for one variable. Okay, do you know what I mean by that? Okay, let's say you want to map buildings, and the building, you're going to have a different symbol for small, medium, and large buildings. Okay, so what you should be going for is something like small dot, medium dot, big dot. What you don't want is small grey dot, medium blue dot, large red dot. Save the change in the colour for another variable. So you might have small, medium, and large in a different colour depending on whether or not it's what the rental value is. Okay, so you can introduce another variable using that. So you've got small, medium, large. You've got different colours, and what about a different symbol? So you could have a small, medium, and large, but it could also be small, triangle, medium, square, large, diamond. But then you're wasting another variable. So you don't want to have these symbols all representing the same thing. You want to have the triangles for the hospitals and the squares for the houses and the diamonds for the schools. Okay? So introduce a different type of symbol only for a different kind of variable. Does that make sense? Don't waste your variables. And don't waste your symbols on different variables. You want to think about the color values, the hues, the size, which you go with, which indicates relationships, not quantitative values. Very difficult to get proportional sized symbols right. The shape, the spacing in between them, the orientation, and here differentiate with differences. So you want to make the things stand out that are different from the other things. So when you're thinking about what you want your visualization to communicate, what you want to think about is, what's the difference that I'm trying to display? And how do I communicate that difference between all of those things and this one thing? Or all of these features and the interesting features that I particularly want to draw out? Does that make sense? Have you come across Edward Tufte? Yeah. Have you come across his Principles of Graphical Integrity? Okay, so Edward Tufte, the design and visualization guru, and his many semi-self-published works on design. Basically, he self-publishes because he has very exacting standards about design and doesn't trust external publishers to get it right. So every time Edward Tufte releases another book, it's got another set of principles of design or principles of graphical integrity or so on. So you will come across lots of different versions of Tufte's principles. but here are some of them from his 1983 book, which is called something like Visualizing Data something. And although he prizes getting to the point and lucid explanation of what he's saying, actually these are a bit wordy, but these are pretty much cut and paste from what he wrote. So here it is. The representation of numbers as physically measured on the surface of the graphic itself should be directly proportional to the numerical quantities represented. Do you know what that means? You want proportional symbols actually to be proportional. Okay. Clear, detailed, and thorough labeling should be used to defeat graphical distortion and ambiguity. Write out explanations of the data on the graphic itself. Label important events in the data. So think carefully about what needs to be labeled and how you're going to do that. Explanations of the data should go on the graphic itself. So that's one of the things that I find a bit weird is, you know, when you generate a map and sometimes you have to write 300 words on what the map means. Does that happen to you sometimes? Happens to me occasionally. When that happens, I know I've got to redo the map. I've got to think more about it. Because what's the point in having a map if I've got to have 300 words of explanation about it? Cut out the map and just have the explanation. Cut out the explanation and get the map right. Show data variation, not design variation. So that's kind of what I was alluding to before. You want to show how the data is. The data are the heart of the map, right? It's not a nice-looking map will make you go, oh, that's a nice design, because you are able to see what's happening in the data, not because it's nice colours and stuff. And he goes on. In time series displays of money, deflated and standardized units of monetary measurement are nearly always better than nominal units. Okay? So you want to be comparing like with like, is what he's saying. So adjust your values for inflation over time. Because if you want to say that a loaf of bread costs 70p now, 40p now, whereas a £4 loaf of bread cost a penny, or 4p in 1880, well, that's, you know, what does that mean? So standardize or deflate or adjust or create index values. The number of information carrying variable dimensions depicted should not exceed the number of dimensions in the data, so don't overdo it. So that's to do with, you know, having lots of different sorts of symbols for one variable. And graphics must not quote data out of context. So he's sort of saying, have some sort of, you know, be honest about the data. Does that make sense? What do you think about these principles? Useful? Anything wrong with any of them? It's not like I have something in mind, it's just you're welcome to think critically about it. Just because he said it doesn't mean it's right, is what I'm saying. Yeah. Okay. Well, have a think about it, because that's the sort of thing that you'll need to do for your essay. So think critically about Tuft and Crack, for that matter. Think about whether what they say is useful in every case. You know, you don't have to just apply what they say to the data that you're given, to the maps that you're given. You can think about whether what they say is worthwhile. So Tuft and data-led graphics. He points out that you should make the visual representation consistent with the numerical representation, and he came up with this idea of the lie factor, where you divide the size of the effect shown in the graphic by the size of the actual effect as you can get it in the data, and that tells you what the lie factor is. Does that make sense? So basically this gives you a value that indicates how much the the values have been distorted on the graphic. Give you an example. Here is the shrinking family doctor graphic from the LA Times in 1979. The percentage of doctors devoted solely to family practice. We've got this change over time, and it's projecting that by 1990, only 12% of doctors, this is in California, only 12% of doctors will be doing family GP stuff, okay? So they've got data from 64 and 75, they're projecting to 1990. So the size of the doctor is supposed to represent the changing percentage, but the size of the doctor does not change in proportion to the actual change that they have in the data. Does that make sense? So you divide the effect by the actual, and you get a life factor of 2.8. You divide the graphic as it's shown by what the actual scenario is. You get 2.8. That's a whopping great lie. That's what Tuft suggests. So be aware that your work might be open to this sort of critique. Now here, we've got data which are represented in a way that don't lie. I think this is the attribution dropped off. Anybody recognise this? I forget who created this. Sorry, I'll try and find out for next time. Anyway, it's spatial data. Got cities, cities of Europe that are or have been capitals of empires, kingdoms or republics represented in the order of their population. So here we've got circles that show the population sizes of these different cities in Europe in about 1800-ish, I think. So what's the problem here? Spatial data that isn't a map, by the way. But, okay, what's the problem with this? You can't read it. You mean you can't read the text because it's too fuzzy? Okay, you can't read the text because it's too fuzzy. What's the problem with the graphics? The circles? Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think ignoring the print reproduction problem, just thinking about the circles, okay? Okay, you can't, right, let's say that these weren't in order. Which has got the bigger population, Madrid or Lisbon? It's hard to say. Copenhagen or Lisbon are next to each other. If you didn't know they were in order, okay, what's the point in having these symbols? It doesn't, and they are in proportion by area. How useful is that? Not very. Okay, it's not giving you a simple, easy, at a glance idea of which is bigger. You don't need the circles at all. You could just have a table. Table in order would be much easier. This is not a great piece of visual communication. And then we have now I think we're booked for 2 hours, but I'm not going to do a 2-hour lecture, right? But shall we keep pushing through, because it would be vastly less than 2 hours, if you're happy not to have a break. Is that okay? We keep going? Cool. Okay, so here we've got this graph which shows these categories, A, B, C, D, E. You can see very easily, when it's a bar chart, what the values are. Really easy to tell. Here you can see relative to each other that E is bigger than D and so on. But you can't tell the values, even relative. So even if you knew that A was 2, if you didn't have the top half, would you be able to say that B was 4? No. And it doesn't matter whether you choose diameter or area as the variable of the circle that changes in proportion. Either way, you can't tell the value. So be really careful of using dot sizes in proportion, because either you'll have an arc map especially, you'll have one tiny one and one gigantic one, and you can't play with the data, you can't read any of them, or you just won't be able to see what the proportion is. Yeah. So I would recommend using only these to represent that one is relatively bigger than the other, but not what the actual proportion is. Does that make sense?
Yes, you know, it's where you can choose what they call dynamic compensation.
Yes.
This says it's
Yeah, I have no problem with using a big symbol to represent something that has a big value. What I'm saying is that how do you know, if I told you that D was 8, would you be able to see what E was? That's my only point. You know that E is bigger than D, but you don't know that E is 5 times as big as A. That's all I'm saying about that. So here are some ways to, which I stole from Longley, I think. Here are some ways to indicate difference, and difference is the important thing, okay? So you get some data, you want to point out what the different things are. So top left, the green dot points out. The green dot pops out, okay? Is that clear to everybody in the room? The green dot? Okay, there's a problem with that. Who can guess what the problem is with the top left one? The green dot pops out. Give you a clue, it applies to about 1 in 20 people.
Oh, colourblind.
I'm colourblind. I don't know which is the green dot. I have no idea which of these dots is green. I really don't. Not a clue.
So you see all of them like...
I see dots. On this screen, it's particularly bad because you could tell me that they were all green and I'd believe you. I suspect that the others are red. Change it to blue, okay? Change it to yellow. Change it to anything but red-green. Red-green is classic colour blindness, and it's going to affect about 1 in 10 men and 1 in 100 women in one way or another. It's fairly common, but not, it's rare enough that, oh, surprise, oh, you can't tell the difference. Green and red. Green and red, impossible. That's why traffic lights have sequences and why plugs have wiring with stripes instead of, brown instead of, you think, why are these the colours? It's to stop people like me from being a danger to ourselves and others, okay? I would highly recommend that if I'm marking any of your work, you do not use green-red colour schemes, okay? That's the one piece of advice I would give you. If you forget anything else, please remember I can't do that. But directions, very easy to see where the oblique lines are in this top right one. Yeah. Very easy to see big versus small. Very easy to see movement. These arrows are indicating oscillation. So basically, if these two with the arrows were vibrating, oscillating, buzzing, you'd be able to spot them instantly. Our eyes are, evolutionarily, movement is what we're designed to see. So if you can have some kind of feedback of a selection that shows that things go bzz when you click on them or something like that, that is a really effective way of demonstrating that it's working. Or highlighting what you want to say. So Tufte, as I said, has every time he publishes something, he has more sets of principles. Show the data, tell the truth. Easy, that's easier said than done, and I'm sure you can think of ways of lying using your map. Help the viewer think about the information, not the design technology. The best design is invisible design. Have you heard that expression before? Best design is no design at all. You don't know it's there. You don't think about, oh, what a pretty map. You just think, without even thinking about it, you get the information. That's the most effective thing. Encourage the eye to compare different pieces of data. So use this, if I go back, use that to compare different pieces of data. Make large data sets coherent. Look for similarities. Generalize where you need to. Group things in sensible ways. Reveal the data at several levels of detail. That essentially means think about how you can, zooming in, see different things, or with selections you're able to see different things. You click on something and it highlights all of the other things that do a similar thing. That kind of thing is quite a good what's the word? A good bit of interaction. interaction is the word. And be integrated with descriptions. So don't have standalone maps that don't come with any kind of text. You know, if you're going to have a map in your in an essay, for instance, you want some kind of reference to it. But you, on the other hand, you do not want to have an explanation that can only be had from the text. You want it to speak for itself as far as possible, as I say. Does all that make sense? Is that all useful? Cool. Have you come across this before? You seen this? Did Dave show it to you over and over again? Okay. Okay, you're familiar with it. Okay, it's beautiful. Best data graphic ever. It's the most wonderful geovisualization, etc., etc., etc. I agree with that. It shows something like 6 different variables. Okay, if you can do anything like this, you'll be just fine. But I don't need to go into too much detail, right? Okay, any questions about any of that? Is that helpful, or just restating obvious stuff? Do you think? Helpful. Cool. Can you think about ways you might integrate some of these points into your own work? Hopefully what you're thinking now is, I'm going to do that on my GeoWeb visualization now. I'm not going to do that.
So
Yeah.
we talk about how maps can visualize other than it's very hard to detect different definitions.
So what Crack has done is try and classify different sorts of visualizations, but the boundaries between the classifications are fluid, so you can get some things that apply, you know, that fall into several different categories, or and not everything will be in one of the categories. You know, they're a bit vague in some cases. What Tufte does is basically try and get people to design better stuff, to make things easier to read, easier to see, these sorts of things. So Tufte is all about the design principles. Crack is all about trying to assign categories to things. Do you see what I mean? We point to something and say, that's a this type under Crack's classification. Whereas Tufte would say, this is good, but this is, you know, Tufte gives you tools for critiquing rather than for describing. Does that make sense? Crack describes, Tufte critiques. You will also hear Tufte's name pronounced as Tufty or Tufty. I think it's Tufte. Might be wrong. He's on Twitter as well, so you're welcome to follow him if you're on Twitter too.